it came from the courts. Specifically, it came from corporate lawyers arguing in the courts that first the 14th Amendment, that constitutional guarantee of equal protection and due process, that it should apply to corporations. Why? The argument is, well, look, if an individual has rights and an individual comes together to do business, this new entity called the Railroad Corporation, or the Pacific Railway Corporation in this case, the entity that's just been created also has rights. So the first case that really actually codified this at the Supreme Court level was a case called Santa Clara versus Pacific Railway in 1886, in which a head note is listed, and this is a complicated story, so I'll gloss it. If folks want to come back to it, we can. But the court clerk reported that the Supreme Court justice, that is to say the head justice, said, we are not of the opinion, or we are not inclined to hear argument about whether a corporation has constitutional rights. We are all of the opinion that it does. And then issued the opinion of the court. Now, again, if you want to learn more about that hidden history, there's a great book called Unequal Protection by Tom Hartman. Big shout out to Vermont. He actually discovered many of the original documents that actually lays out this case in this state. Gathering dust at a historical, I'm not sure where it was actually in Vermont, if anybody knows. But it was somewhere in Vermont at an old historical society. He actually found some of the original documents that make this case. But Karen, here's the point. Laws were being written at the county level in California that said, we're going to tax land differently. If an individual human being owns the land, it gets taxed at one rate. But if a railroad company owns the land, we're going to tax it at a much higher rate. They were doing that for two reasons. One, the railroad corporations had a lot of money and therefore could afford to pay more. And secondly, because they said what railroad companies do with the land is actually using right-of-ways to run railroads through our community, and they're causing all sorts of fires because of the sparks flying off, and they're a public nuisance with the smoke, and it's just, there's a lot of money associated with us as a city for dealing with it, so we're going to tax them differently. Up until that point, it had always been assumed that either a city, county, or state government had the right to do that. The court said, no, the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution says no person shall be denied equal protection of the law or due process of the law. And since we are going to say that a corporation is a person with rights, the corporation has the 14th Amendment rights to equal protection. And you're treating one person, a human being, differently than another person, a corporation. So that's where it came from, and over the next 100 years, you have a continued building upon this idea, case after case after case, and I don't mean to sound sycophantic to the organization, but one more shout out to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. There is the most amazing document that I've ever seen that in one spot really outlines just how pernicious and how pervasive this outrageous legal doctrine has become. And you can see it in what's known as the corporate personhood timeline that actually outlines and describes all of the different cases in which corporations have been claimed to have constitutional rights. So that's a long way to answer the question, Karen, that says it came from corporate lawyers making arguments. It was codified in law by the U.S. Supreme Court. And I also want to say very quickly, when it first came down, people and lawyers went apoplectic. There were actually calls to amend the Constitution right after this. In fact, no less a radical militant organization known as the Indiana Bar Association. Actually, 2 years after this case, the president of the Indiana Bar Association wrote an article that was titled, should the 14th Amendment, should the U.S. Constitution be amended to clarify the meaning of the 14th Amendment? And honestly, part of the problem was that that movement did not actually popularize, and instead folks argued, well, we can fix this problem with a few laws, or we can fix this problem with a few other policy changes. And what happened was the slippery slope began. Corporations as instruments began to gain more and more power, both under the Constitution and more laws that had heretofore controlled corporate power at the statutory level began to be overturned, not just at the courts, but also through the legislation. So you asked the question. I wish that it had been an easier and sharper answer, but I hope I answered the question. Okay, good.
Tell us what percentage of the 14th Amendment cases refer to minorities versus corporations?
I'm sure Gary knows the answer, but he's giving me what's called a softball question. And so get served up that softball. The question is, so roughly what percentage of the cases construing the 14th Amendment had been used to protect the interest of African Americans, or women for that matter, or people, human beings, versus how many are actually being brought on behalf of to protect the, quote, rights of corporations? Answer, about 95% for corporations. About 5% of the cases are on behalf of human beings. How'd I do? Thanks for the question. Out of the park. Number 2 was Matt.
This is any sort of legal entity that's defined as a corporation, a group of people coming together to serve a particular purpose.
Absolutely, Matt. Let me answer that first, and then if you have a follow-up, because what you just asked is a very powerful question, and I want to make sure everybody in the circle understands just how astute that question was. So Matt's saying, wait a minute, we're not just talking about limited liability for-profit corporations here. And the answer is that's correct. We at Move to Amend say only human beings actually have inherent and alienable constitutional rights. If the state creates a for-profit or a non-profit or any other artificial entity, that entity can be properly controlled by the operation of the political discourse and debate. And I also want to be clear, Matt, I'm not anti-corporation. The Move to Amend coalition is not anti-corporation. Corporations can and have been used for incredibly important and powerful and positive reasons. But to say that this entity that usually just represents concentrated capital, but at any rate is just a concept or a construct, somehow this entity now has inherent and inalienable constitutional rights. In the words of that great liberal justice, William Rehnquist, yuck, 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 the idea of corporations having constitutional rights confuses metaphor with reality. So you bet. What I'm saying is these artificial entities created by operation of the state do not have constitutional rights.
So, given sort of the political realities of this nation at the moment, from a tactical point of view, you need 2/3 and then ultimately 3/4 of states to ratify. So part of the question is, from your work, your involvement with this, how close to that are we? And then in the meantime, since it comes out of the Secretary of State granting and possibly revoking a corporate charter, what powers are currently on the books in a place like Vermont, or could be strengthened through state legislation?
Listen, great question. I genuinely and sincerely believe that we're going to be able to amend the U.S. Constitution within a decade. It's going to take about 10 years for this movement to get so loud, to get so powerful, and to move from the local, state, and federal level to completely and utterly shift the political discourse in this country. We will amend the Constitution within a decade to abolish corporate constitutional rights and to declare that money is not speech. In the meantime, as this movement continues to grow and get more powerful and people become more aware of not just, hey, corporations have power, but the degree to which corporations are controlling us, we will get back to and remember all these tools that are still available right now that are just sort of, gathering dust in the political toolbox. So, what could happen? Right now, Vermont State Attorney General could begin revoking corporate charters tomorrow if she or he, and I don't know if your Attorney General is a man or a woman, so if she or he had the political will, you could simply go through and start to look at any corporation with a repeated history of violating safety, health, environmental, worker protection laws, and simply either revoke the corporate charter or if not incorporated in Vermont, simply revoke the certificate of authority to do business and just say, we don't want businesses with these kinds of atrocious records to be able to come in and do business in Vermont. It's a privilege to do business in Vermont. So that's something that could actually be done right now. There are a number of other mechanisms that can be done right now. As it relates to money in elections, there's nothing to stop the Vermont legislature from absolutely requiring full disclosure of all contributions and making that immediately available. That's something that could happen like that, and it's got political support across the spectrum. In addition, there's nothing to stop Vermont from creating a publicly financed election system so long as it was voluntary. The Supreme Court currently says you can't mandate one, but you can create voluntary methods where people participate there. So, and there's a lot more to say and a lot more that can be done. I have a feeling a democracy movement. Yes to disclosure laws. Yes to publicly financed elections. Yes to corporate charter revocation. And yes to amending the Constitution as a movement, a political instrument, a political organizing tactic to help grow and nurture the movement. This is not either or, it's both and. Jimmy.
So, I think you've said a lot of good things. I just want to say a couple of things. First, that the constitutional amendment idea has problems, not just that it's so hard to pass, but also it gives the court more, this court that's proven to misinterpret the First Amendment, to give corporations and to give the rich, not just corporations, but anyone who has money, enormous power over elections. But it also, but now giving them more text, what's going to happen? They're going to misinterpret that too. And it also has the effect of legitimizing their involvement in the question of elections, election financing. The Constitution provides already, without a constitutional amendment, that Congress be the judge of the elections of its members.
I understand what you're saying, and I like what you're saying, but I think there's a bigger picture, okay? And I go back to what I think I hear you saying. We need a movement for democracy. And it goes back to what this gentleman was picking up on or directing us the theme of. There are several fronts on which we can move forward, just on the Citizens United Corporation front. Money, I agree, James, is an issue. But I think what we need to do is come and unite and move forward on all these issues. I'm an old company commander, served in Vietnam. And you have to have strategies and tactics that you can move on. And you don't necessarily move on one front. You move on several fronts. You have to have a reserve. So I think we need to, as a movement, make sure that we come together and unite for a democracy movement. And so I really feel and applaud what you say in that regards. The reality is that, and I think you and I like to use the word empire, okay? And I use corporations. People say, oh, you're against corporations. And like you, I say, no, I'm not. I'm against what I label empire corporations. They're the bad guys. Very different than good businesses. They're undemocratic. They're uncapitalistic. They do not believe in free markets. I personally believe our challenge is going to be, and I'll end on this note, David, is they don't care whether 60 or 70 or 80% of us want something. They're already a part of an empire organization. They're going to do what they damn well please. And you can see that in some of the states where they're closing down towns and cities, okay, and taking away our right to rule our own municipalities. And so I think we unite under the banner of the democratic movement, and I applaud that.
I absolutely believe that there are multiple different strategies and tactics that can be used to help to build the democracy movement in the United States. I can tell you this. I've been working on trying to help nurture and build a democracy movement specifically for about 20 years. And I've never been part of anything that has been so broad, that has gone so systemic and so deep, and has been so successful as Move to Amend has been in a short 2 years. We didn't even exist as a coalition until 2010. Today we have several hundred organizations that are participating. We have 70 local affiliates that are actually forming in their own communities to advance this work, and we are networked with a growing number of other groups, some on the political left, some on the political right. We're actually finding common ground. So for my way of thinking, the move to amend approach is working. So, you know, I want to encourage folks, if there are other things that you feel like are more effective, absolutely do them. I'm not trying to pull you away from it. But if the approach that I'm describing makes sense to you, if it sounds exciting and inspiring, then please do join us, and let's actually help to make the promise of a democratic republic a reality in the United States. Because the fact of the matter is, we've never actually had a functioning democratic republic. We have had movements that have made us more democratic and more just. The abolition of slavery, women getting the right to vote, the creation of the Social Security Administration, unemployment insurance, the trade union movement, the civil rights movement. The reality is, the only time there have actually been real significant gains made in how we live as a society in this country has been when there have been mass movements and an electoral arm representing that mass movement. When you have people who are running for office on behalf of and as part of that movement who are challenging at the ballot box. So part of what Move to Amend is also doing, and I know you're up, Robin, is to begin a 501c4 organization that will actually say, we're going to start actually doing candidate questionnaires. And whether you're at the local, state, or federal level, what's your position on corporate constitutional rights? What's your position that money is speech? We want to know, and we think voters want to know, to force them to actually say, which side are you on? Because as a former trade unionist myself, as a proud member of the workers' movement in this country, we are in a proverbial, which side are you on? Are you on the side of corporate America? Or are you on the side of the people?